It's a pleasure to be here, and really enjoyed even yesterday evening getting to know some of the pastors and leaders in the area, and we had a really great conversation. And what I'm hoping to do today is for us to, if yesterday some of us, we jumped right into the deep end, but we're going to get out of the pool, go back to the front, and begin slowly stepping into the pool one more time, foot by foot, toe by toe. And so this morning, I just want to encourage us to think about the very foundations of anti-racism, and particularly what we're called to as followers of Jesus in light of that. And then the next session, we'll go a little farther into the kind of work that we can be doing as the church to pursue unity, but as we actually participate and seek racial justice in our world. So I often get invitations to speak, especially since my books came out that Andy mentioned. And I'm a Pennsylvania boy, so I kind of bounce back and forth between Philly to Harrisburg to Philly, and then back to Harrisburg. And my second time coming back to Harrisburg, a lot of people knew me not then only as like Drew from around the way, but all of a sudden now Drew also the author and speaker. And so immediately invitations to come and speak as I was kind of moving back into the area. And one of the white churches, pretty prominent white church in the area, invited me to come and speak, and they were doing a whole entire series in January on race and racism and thinking about how their discipleship relates to it. And so the Sunday school class was reading Trouble I've Seen, and then I came the very last Sunday and I preached and engaged the Sunday school class and had a really great time preaching and helping them think through, the call on the church in light of our history and our historical context that we find ourselves in. And one of the things I recommended for them to do was to go on this civil rights bus trip that one of my friends leads, right? And they took that very seriously, and so they went on this trip, and a year later, they invited one of my friend who leads that trip to come, and they almost the exact same Sunday, a year later, he is back speaking in front of the congregation. And if you can imagine a church after many people have gone on this trip, they're showing images, they got pictures, they got sentimental music going on during the worship service, right? Just kind of reflecting on all that they had been through and sharing that with the rest of the congregation. And as that wrapped up, and the pastor was about to get up to introduce the speaker, an older white gentleman stood up in the congregation and he yelled out, "Why can't we just get over it?" That's right. Why can't we just get over it? And then apparently he got up and he left, right? He stormed out. He was gone. So there was really no conversation much after that. And of course, I knew the pastor, he tried to, it's in the air, it's in the atmosphere. What are you going to do after that, right? So he tried to, do his best to try to, create a space that was hospitable for my friend to speak right after that. And then my friend got up and did end up speaking. But I often thought about, what would I have done had somebody, while I was right about to speak, yelled out, "Why can't we just get over it," right? How am I going to respond when that's kind of the spirit in the air? And so I thought about it, and I thought, maybe this is actually great opportunities. These can be learning opportunities, transformative opportunities, moments of grace, right, where transformation could happen. If you lean in sometimes you got to lean into the awkwardness of the moment. And so I thought maybe before this gentleman left the room so quick, I might want just a conversation with him and have some questions, right? To just try to understand where he was coming from and his own lived experience that left him thinking that it was time to get over it. So I thought I might ask him, just assuming nothing about his life, right? That he could just tell me for himself. I want to hear about your life. What was it that you in your own life have been so committed to racial justice for decades, right? Maybe he was 70 years old. So have you been committed for racial justice for 70 years so that now you can't imagine there's any more work to be done because you've just been at it so hard and the work is just complete, right? Now it's time to get over it. Then maybe I'd ask him about, his family lineage, right? Intergenerationally, and ask him, like, maybe, I don't know, maybe he comes from a line where, like, his great-great-great-grandfather was an abolitionist in slavery. Maybe his dad was friends with Dr. King. And, maybe he just had this long, long legacy, right, of just constant intergenerational faithfulness. Everybody that he knew all the way through his line were just faithful and resisting and struggling against the racial oppression as the different manifestations formed in our society today, right? I don't want to assume anything about his life, so I'd ask him some questions about his story. I'd ask him maybe about his community, right? Because maybe when he looked to his left and he looked to his right in his own faith community, everybody had been just doing the work, right? Just all around him, just so committed to the work of racial justice, and that he felt, again, after all of this work, individually, intergenerationally, in terms of communally, the work was done. Everyone had just put in the work, and he could see there was nothing else to be done, right? Now, of course, I don't know about you, but I've never met anybody that fits that characteristic, right? Because the fact of the matter is that for most folks, the question isn't really how do we get over it. The real question is how do we get on it, right? For most folks, they've never begun the journey of actually grappling with the ways that racial oppression and racism have destroyed and devastated our world and have destroyed how we see and relate to one another, and the impact that it has that advantages and disadvantages others. And so many of us, the challenge here is not how do we get over it, but in light of centuries, right? Centuries and centuries of harm that's been a part of our story, how do we get on it for the first time? And I think that for us, certainly as followers of Jesus, that this is a crucial and critical question for us, right? As we consider the fact that God in Jesus Christ broke into our world, right? And inaugurated, whether you call it the kingdom of God, the reign of God, some call it the kingdom of God, whatever you want to call, God has broken in the midst of the cycles of sin and violence and oppression and harm, and has created a new thing right under the nose of the old order, right? A new creation, a new world has begun, and we are to be participants in this new thing that God is doing in the world, participating in God's healing and God's justice and God's restoration, right? As a part of our calling of joining and being co-laborers with God in God's creation. And so this is my invitation for those that haven't yet maybe really stepped into this work, that we have this, yes, centuries of harm, right? That the church has been, and we'll talk about this in the second session, but church has been at the center of, right? As it relates to racial oppression. But we also have this great opportunity to follow Jesus into the world and to participate in the healing and the justice of God in our world as well. So, many times when many churches begin to realize that there is a need to reckon with race, right? Sometimes we come up with really, really superficial answers to really complex problems, right? And so, we think, all right, centuries of racial oppression, and I got the answer. Let's do a pulpit exchange, and that'll solve our problems, right? Centuries of oppression, and let's just we'll choir swap a little bit. Maybe we'll even do a potluck, right? We'll go all the way out and do the potluck. And somehow that's going to magically erase the centuries of oppression and harm that have devastated our world and our communities. I remember on one occasion when I was still an MDiv student, there was another pastor I just knew just a little bit, and he was also a student at that time, and he wanted to reach out to me he knew that I had been doing like workshops at that time. This was a while, like almost a decade ago, doing workshops on race for churches and conferences. And so he reached out and he was like, yeah, could we just, meet maybe halfway? I lived in Philly, he lived in the suburbs of Philly. So we met at a McDonald's, right? It was a McDonald's about partway through, middle of the summer, hot, right? And there we go. We meet at McDonald's to just kind of get together and meet. And I always joke that, so now y'all can tease me a little bit because I'm a northerner. So when you ask for tea, right, in the north, you're not gonna get sweet tea, right? Not in the Northeast. And sometimes the most readable sweet tea is like the cheap fast food stuff from like McDonald's and stuff like that, right? And I'm still a sucker for any kind of sweet tea. Certainly the Southern sweet tea is the best, but I'll make do with a little, just pure sugar from McDonald's in a cup, right? It still does the right things for me, I won't lie, right? And it's really bad for you because it's just sugar. You could like stick your straw in it, it won't even move because it's just sugar. You start drinking, your dentist miles away knows you've done something terribly wrong, right? But it's good. Don't do it, but it's really good. Anyway, so there we are. We're just sharing sweet teacups, and we're talking and getting to know each other, sharing stories, realizing we have differences as well as things in common with one another. And as we're doing that, eventually, like partway through, my friend, he grabs one of the cups and he puts it right in between us, and he begins to give a little kind of talk, right? He all of a sudden is like, he switches modes a little bit, and it gets really serious, and he's like, Drew, you see this cup? On one side of the cup, there's a logo. On the other side, there's writings, and I can't see what's on your side of the cup, and you can't see what's on my side of the cup, and so I need your eyes to see what's on, your side of the cup, and you need my eyes what's on my side of the cup. And I was like, oh, we're having like a cute Sunday school after special kind of thing going on. Like we're having a moment, right? It was definitely a moment that was going on. And so he goes on and then he finishes, and I say, that's really nice, but like, that's not the way things work. And I said something that probably is a little bit abrasive and probably maybe can be interpreted as rude. I already know what's on your side of the cup. That's what I told him. Then I knew that probably was a little jarring, so I had to explain what I meant, right? So I went on and I said, well, see, here's the thing, growing up, even in an all-black neighborhood, right, in majority black school and all that, I still had majority white teachers, books, Eurocentric history, Eurocentric literature, all of those things, right? When I went off to college, my first year, I was at this white Christian college, I was the only African-American on my floor. My first year, right? I had to learn how to navigate that space and understand what people are thinking, how they're interpreting who I am, and how they're interpreting my body, right? And every stage of my education, disproportionately white teachers and professors, even at schools that said they were committed to racial justice, right? And so there's never been a stage in my life where I have not had to understand white dominant culture, navigate it, survive it, sometimes resist it, but certainly understanding all the complexities because it had an impact on my livelihood. And one of the things I wanted to explain to him is I said, look, you can go your whole entire life and never step foot in a black community. And he was also an author too. And I said, and it's not even going to impact your livelihood. Right? And you can go and you can write books and have no understanding of black history, black intellectual thought, culture, music, trends, none of that, right? And just move in white dominant cultural space, oblivious to other people's worlds, and it's not going to impact you at all. And so what I wanted him to begin to see was that, I could tell by the conversation that we were having that he felt like we're making some real progress here, right? Some real things are happening. Walls are being torn down, right? And there's a way in which we can imagine these cultural exchange moments, right? Is all that's needed. That's just the end goal. We just share, giving back and forth, and we stop there, and then we've accomplished. Now racism is dying away, right? And it doesn't take seriously the fact that there are systems, structures, policies, institutions that advantage some and disadvantage others, that are built to norm some people's lives, and meanwhile other people are being disregarded and neglected, right? Systematically, institutionally, through policy and practice. And so once we begin to see that we don't have a level playing field that we're operating in, and that many of these institutions are designed for him to be at the center of the world, right? When we begin to recognize that, then we begin to realize that, again, these really simplistic answers are insufficient for the really big, complex problems that we've got to face. Yes, I'm not saying don't do the pulpit swap. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm not saying don't do the potluck and all that stuff, but don't imagine that that alone is going to get us where we need to go, that we've got more deeper work that we've got to do together if we're going to begin to actually participate in God's healing, restoration, and justice in the world. So many of you may remember, it was quite a little while now that when Paula Deen was in the news, it feels like a decade ago, maybe it wasn't quite that long, but it feels like a while ago, but there was a moment, right, way back, if you can remember, when Paula Deen was in the news. It was not for good news. It wasn't for her good cooking, right? It was because she had, it got exposed that I think it was, she used the N-word. She had talked about wanting this plantation-style wedding where black people are serving. It was all kinds of stuff. It was just terrible, right? And all across the news, everybody was kind of running. It was 24-hour news cycle. All her racism was just out there for everyone to see, right? And what was striking about the moment was that everybody, it was one of the few times our country was unified. Everybody knew that this was bad, right? And it was bad. Shame on Paula Deen. Bad. You're so racist, right? Everybody. It didn't matter left, right. It didn't matter. Everybody could see that Paula Deen was a racist and this was really bad. And initially, I kind of felt the same. I was like, yeah, bad Paula Deen. Shame on you. How racist, right? But then something began to happen. I was like, something just doesn't quite seem right about this moment. How is it that everybody, right, is wagging the finger at Paula Deen? Something's just not quite right about this moment. So I thought about it. And as I thought about it, I realized, I was like, wait a minute now. Did Paula Deen originate racism? Was she the instigator of this? Was she a mad scientist in a lab somewhere where she's cooking it up and exposing it to our water or something? Why is it that everybody's pointing the finger at Paula Deen, right? What is it about her specifically in light of this historical moment? And so as I thought about it, I was like, no, Paula Deen is not the originator of racism. And if Paula Deen is not the originator of racism, then how do we understand the kind of racist ideas that she was espousing, right? How do we make sense of it? And I thought, it's pretty simple, right? If you want to understand how Paula Deen, where she got these ideas from, you just need to know American history, right? Because all of a sudden you'll see that she did not originate it. She was the byproduct of socialization, right? She was formed by generation after generation after generation of racist communities, right? That formed her, right? She didn't originate it. She was formed into the perspectives that she held. And if she was formed by society, then why is society, everybody pointing the finger at Paula Deen? In some ways, scapegoating one individual and not taking responsibility for how the society produced her and millions others like her over and over and over again for centuries, right? In fact, I think that the only reason why Paula Deen got in any trouble at all is because she didn't update her racism card, right? She did old school racism rather than 21st century racism that would have been seen as more acceptable and okay in our present day, right? She didn't learn the nuances of how to communicate the same racist ideas with more nuance and sophistication, right? A little less direct and offensive, right? But I think that it's a reminder for me, anytime I think about Paula Deen, I'm reminded that there's this temptation to want to place blame on just individuals and not see the societies that form us, the ways that we're socialized into society, the ways that it's embedded deeply in our culture, in our rhetoric, in our ideology, right? And that if we are going to actually challenge racism, some of what we're going to have to do, and this is significant for us as Christians, is confess the ways that we also can be deeply complicit in these same systems and structures, that sin also is running through us. And we're going to have to do some self-examination work to question, what is our relationship to the society? Are we resisting it? Are we upholding and bolstering it? Are we just deeply silent to and benefiting and advantaging from the harm and ideology that's been a part of our society for long? There's some confession work that has to be done, right? Some self-examination work that's got to be done, some interrogating, right, before God. Someone last night said, what does it mean for us to search me, oh God, right? And to reckon with the ways that our own lives have not necessarily been faithful. And so there's some deeper work, and I think the moment that we try to scapegoat individuals without owning and looking at our own participation and our own relationship to what God is doing and what the society has been forming us into, I think we're going to find one more way, again, to not find deliverance and transformation in our own lives. How many of you all are familiar with the Clark doll experiments? Anybody? No? There's quite a few hands. I know a lot of college students, I think a lot of times encounter this in Psychology 101, right, and things like that. Maybe if you've done some civil rights history as well, you might have encountered some of it through there as well. But in the 1940s, there was experiments done, some studies done, just trying to understand how race and identity and formation work in that kind of way. And what they did was that they took one child, it's in the South, one child at a time, black child, and they'd put two dolls in front of them, a white doll and a black doll, and they just ask them a series of questions. Which one is the good doll? Which one is the bad doll? Which one is the pretty doll? Which one is the ugly doll, right? And the reason why people still look at this study today is not because of how the white children responded, and maybe we're not going to be surprised, right, that overwhelmingly the white children picked everything white as right and white as good, right? So which doll is the good doll? They're looking and they're pointing at the white doll. Which doll is the bad doll? They're pointing at the black doll, right? People are not, nobody was, even still, are not that surprised that in the 1940s, little white children growing up in Jim Crow had a preference for whiteness, right? But what was shocking for people, and that people maybe did not expect, was that the black children are just also humans who are internalizing ideas that were prevalent in the air that they were raised in as well. And so where a lot of people thought, maybe, I imagine some people might think the black children might have reversed it, right? Reverse racism, flip it on its head. But what we actually found was that many of them, not to the same degree as the white children, but many of them also had internalized the same kind of white supremacist, anti-black ideology to different degrees, right? So when they're being asked the question, which doll is the good doll, there's many of them that are pointing to the white doll. And which one is the ugly doll? And many of them are pointing to this black. And then when they were asked the question, after giving negative attributes to the black doll, which doll looks most like you, they pointed to the black doll, which suggests that they actually were deeply internalizing, right, also these race ideas. And it's a helpful reminder that these are powerful ideologies and forces and sentiments that impact all human beings. And now we can say, certainly it was not impacting the black children to the same degree as the white children, and that's because they're part of communities that were, at least many of them, that were resisting and trying to help them see that they're fearfully and wonderfully made, right? But the fact of the matter is they're all humans susceptible to the power and the influence of these really destructive ideologies. And I think for us, as we begin to grapple with racism, we have to take seriously the way that that racial hierarchy, right, is embedded into the logics of white supremacy and racism. That it's a hierarchy that is literally designed to distort how we see one another. Sometimes we lose that side of things, that it's about optics too, right? That we don't see right anymore. We have a lens that is distorted, and so that how I see you and how you see me, and even how we see ourselves can be diseased and distorted, and it is a marring of God's creation, God's good creation, right? And so we've got to take seriously racial hierarchy, the very structuring that says that some people, that some people are more worthy, beautiful, good, have closer proximity to God, and these temptations, excuse me, these temptations to see folks in that way, again, are a direct violation of the idea that we were created in the image of God, equally before God. None godlike, none less than, all created in the image of God. And so fundamentally, we've got to, as a part of our anti-racism work, be honest about how racial hierarchy shows up in the life of the church, in our norms, in what we lift up and centralize. I mean, simple things like whose voices, right, are at the center? Whose theological work do we take seriously? Whose music and art and creativity, like are we disvaluing or decentering the least, last, lost, and little ones, and then centering and overvaluing those that have been lording it over others, right? And so we've got some work to do to interrogate the ways that even our own eyes, and what the tricky part of this is that it's unconscious, right? So the optics side of it is not something that people are doing, that it's not about hate. It's not about hating other people. It's about your vision is diseased, and so you can go around thinking, I just see objectively, and at the same time, as you imagine that you're just objective, you're diseased by the way that you're actually interpreting what's happening all around you. It's almost like the famous, people talk about, like, you see a white person running down the street and you imagine, oh, they're going for a jog, right? You see a black person running down the street and you're like, oh, what's he running from, right? It's the same, it's the disease that filters everything that we see and how we make sense of the world around us. One year, I think it was like 2017, I went to a conference. It was like an invite-only conference for people who are working on justice from around the country. Like 300 people were invited. And it was on different topics. Some people were there because of their work around racial justice, some around like economic justice, some environmental justice, some gender justice. It was just a range of different topics. And it was like a convening and a conference. And I was just a couple years into like doing more like out-of-state stuff, so I was just grateful to be invited. And there were like amazing folks that I looked up to, civil rights icons like Reverend C.T. Vivian, and Pastor Otis Moss III was there, and Lisa Sharon Harper. And I could go on and on, all these different folks from different spheres who were all in the room, well, in the conference. And then they had, during lunchtime, they had a special, based on like why you were invited, like special convenings based on those special interests and work areas that you were invested in. And so for lunch, there I was, and all those folks that I just named were all a part of that racial justice conversation around lunch. And again, I'm probably one of the youngest guys in the room. I'm just happy to be in there. I'm like a fly in the room, just eating it all up. And as conversation broke out, almost immediately, things just jumped right into things, right? And people started saying like, can you be Christian and white? That's what someone asked, right? Can you be Christian and white? And then, so someone answered and they said, well, I guess it depends on what you mean, because if whiteness is a construct that was created for the purpose of dominating and enslaving and plundering people, well, you can't be that and Christian at the same time, right? That social domination is incompatible with Christianity, and so you can't be white and Christian in that way, right? And there were other conversations that went on. It was just like, but then we all went on our separate ways, and I walked out the room, I went down the hallway, and as I was standing there, there was one white woman who was in the room who began to walk down the hallway and walk towards me. And so as she's walking towards me, she comes over. She was like, hey, what did you think about that conversation? I said, I thought it was pretty interesting. Like, it was a wide-ranging, interesting conversation. And then she said, what do you think about the fact that they said white people can't be Christian? So I was like, all right, I already know where this is going. So I said, well, I don't actually think they were saying that white people can't be Christian, right? As in people of European descent or lighter skin. I don't think that's what they're saying, but I think what they were getting at was the idea that you can't be formed into whiteness, right? The idea, the logic of imagining that you are gods among men, right? That you lord it over others, that you are at the center of the universe, and that everyone else is there for your beck and call, right? Like a way of being in the world is what they were interested in, not in the color of one's skin, right? And this is a hard one, I think, for people to make sense of, is the differentiation between, because you hear the language of whiteness now, and not everyone understands, like, they're not talking about the skin color. They're talking about a way of being formed in the world to relate to others, right? A way of operating and living and moving in the world as though you own the earth and everything therein, right? So what does it mean to say that kind of, I mean, Matthew 20 to 28, the disciples are all talking about what it means for them to be great, right? And Jesus got to huddle them up, right? Because they got big dreams about being at the top of the empire and such. And Jesus huddles them up and he tells them, like, no, the Gentiles, they lord it over you, but not so among you, right? We come, we serve. I come to be a servant and to give my life as a ransom for all. And that's the way of life that we're all going to be invited into, right? It's an anti-dominating way of life to follow Jesus. It's a renunciation of that kind of way of life. And so what does it mean to say that Christian discipleship in the way of Jesus Christ is incompatible with that kind of domination? It's incompatible with whiteness. That is a way of forming one's identity and way of being in the world that doesn't just see oneself as a part of a shared humanity, all made in the image of God, but sees that hierarchy that's lived out and practiced in our lives in ways that, again, we might be unconscious of every day, right? And so I always, whenever I think of that woman coming, and she, to be fair, it was striking because as I was talking, she started crying a little bit, like there was a tear coming, but it wasn't like a shutting down, right? But it was awkward. I always think as a black man with a white woman crying in front of me in public, I'm like, you're gonna get me in trouble here, like let's be careful. But at the same time, she actually owns what I was saying. And one of the things I did find out later that that was not the conversation she was invited to. She kind of creeped in, and that's not the work she had been doing. She was just interested in it. So it was interesting that she felt the right to just enter into that space even without the invitation. So one of the things I did tell her, though, was that, it sounds like you both care about justice, but also have not interrogated your own racial identity. Because most white people don't think that they have a racial identity. They think everyone else does but them, right? And so you haven't interrogated, and so there's something personal happening here, which is causing you to even literally get emotional as we're talking about how whiteness was created in the midst of colonial conquests and slavery and racial oppression. That needs to be worked out. And it sounds like, we were having a higher level conversation, and there's some very basic things that you got to work through first. And again, she received those things, and I was grateful for that. But I think it's an invitation that folks, if you're white in particular, you've got to do some work around your own whiteness. How and why did your people become white, right? Like I always say, if we took a time machine back to the 1400s and we were in the middle of like Germany or something and we said, let's gather all the white people together. No white would know what you're talking about. They would look at you strange. The white people, who are the white people, right? Because that wasn't a term that people identified with, right? These were terms that were created only in the aftermath of colonialism and slavery and racial oppression, that were identities deemed to justify a particular way of being in relating to other people in the world. Interrogate that, follow that path, and figure out what it means to not be formed any longer in whiteness. One of the real challenges, again, when we're thinking about this idea of racial identity and whiteness, is this reality is that most people, we trust our own judgment. We figure, I call it as I see it. It is what it is, right? Everyone thinks that. But the fact of the matter is that we see dimly now. We're finite beings, right? None of us see all. None of us have the advantage of a godlike vantage point on all things. We're finite, we're limited, we're fragile human beings, creatures, not the creator, right? So what does it mean when we begin to think about how we evaluate and make sense of the world when we have sometimes this overly powerful sense of objectivity and certainty about our interpretation of things, right? And I noticed that, especially in Christian spaces, there is a strong tendency for white Christians to kind of take what I call the referee position, right? They imagine that they're neutral, that they are objective, and that they can interpret and tell everyone else who's right and who's wrong and who's in bounds and who's out of bounds, right? Think about sports, right? The referee's the one not playing the game, is outside of the game, right? And can tell everybody else, you're doing it right, you're doing it wrong. So black Christians, you got that Jesus is Lord, but he don't care about your livelihood, your well-being, your thriving in this world, your embodied experience. That's out of bounds questions. That's not actually real theology, right? I'll tell you how to do real Christian theology and real Christian practice, right? And so there's this sense in which some think that they can referee everyone else and that they're not participants in the conversation, but they are outside of it, protecting it from making sure that it's happening and unfolding in the right way, right? And so this temptation to be the referee becomes really dangerous because it disallows one to actually engage in humility in conversation with others with the possibility of being changed by others, right? If you're objective and you're the referee, you just got to tell everyone else what to do. But if you're a participant, then you've got to respond and engage just like on the same terms as everyone else. What does it mean to reject this posture of being the referee? I think about it all the time when I think about even their own discipline of theology, right? For a long time, if you were to study theology, all it meant was studying white Europeans, right? Either mostly from the 16th century, right? And if you're lucky, then maybe you get a few contemporary white theologians as well, all white men, right? And then you've done theology. And what they call it's not particular theology, it's not contextual, it's just theology. It's the classics, right? Now, how is it that that's the classics, right? Just a very small subset of people who are in a particular context at a particular time wrestling with particular questions, and some of them leading them to very bad particular responses to their social setting, but it's just neutral theology. And then everyone else gets a label, black theology, Asian theology, Latin American. Everyone else has a context, and they're particular, but white people and white men, they just hover above the realities of the world, right? No, everyone's theology is particular. None of us are objective. None of us are God. None of us can play referee. And when we can step down from that idolatrous posture, we can actually begin to have conversations and learn and see the world not only with new eyes, but through the eyes of others as well. Again, when we're thinking about whiteness, one of the things that's really challenging, I learned this when I was in college. I'd have some friends who would come up to me and they'd be like, oh, Drew, man, it's so cool that you have a culture. I wish I had a culture. I'm just plain. I was like, how does that work? And so I told them, I was like, trust me, you have a culture and I can see it, right? But it's like fish in water, right? Just couldn't see their own culture. And to be fair, this is only about, right? This is just about being participants in dominant culture anywhere, right? That there's a tendency for people who participate in dominant culture to not be able to see their own cultural particularities, their own specificities. And so they move around imagining that they are normal, plain, culturalists, right? And I think one of the best examples, I always think, I don't know if y'all have them here, but certainly in Pennsylvania, we got the ethnic aisle in the grocery store. Y'all got the ethnic aisle, right? And I always think, like, what exactly are we saying is happening here, right? Let's just think for a moment, right? What are we saying is, so this one aisle is where all culture and ethnicity reside, and everything is just neutral, right? So like Pop-Tarts and no, these are very historical and cultural, contextual things, right? You take that to another world, another time, and they're like, what in the world are Hot Pockets, right? And like, this is very cultural, right? Everything is cultural. There's no such thing as like some things are ethnic. But by constructing the world in that way, it exposes a way of seeing and interpreting the world, right? It's that white people can imagine that we're just neutral and outside of us, all this cultural indifference is happening all around us, right? No. You are also cultural and you have particularities, and your inability to recognize your own cultural inabilities is actually dangerous, because then it means that you are going to impose that onto other people and think it's neutral. Right? There's a power move. There's a strange way in which the power move to not acknowledge one's own particularity. Because then it's the standard, it's the norm. And then you can universalize it and impose it on others, right? And I think that is one of the ways in which, again, white identity can sometimes be trapped in this idea of being invisible to one's own self, and then universalizing those things onto others as well. So when I was in Harrisburg for the first time, I was a youth pastor, and I worked at an after-school program there. Harrisburg is now it's like 50, I think at that time it was like 60% black. I think the black population has dropped down to around 50% black, large Latino community as well, other immigrant groups, and a decent amount of white people as well there. But Allison Hill, where I lived, it was once a majority white neighborhood, but then white flight took place, and now it's a majority black and brown neighborhood. And so as I was serving in there, one particular day I was late for a meeting that I needed to get to, back then I had my 92 Mercury Sable as my first car, bought it for $1,000, I love that baby. So I was hopping in my little hoopty, I was driving through Market Street. Market Street is, as you go down, like, it's like Hood in general, but like once you get to like 15th Street, 14th Street, like it's hood, right? And it's a neighborhood where you just don't see white people. There are just no white people there. White people, except for what I call like the folks that got like left behind, who were like there from like way back, who couldn't participate in the white flight. There's a few of them, but other than that, like, you just don't see white people hanging around in this neighborhood at all. So there I am, and I'm driving through, and I'm approaching like 15th Street, and all of a sudden, as I look up and see ahead, there's like a whole big bunch of white people outside. Something like, what is going on? Why are there so many white people on the hill today? Like, what's happening? And so I'm looking, and as I'm getting closer, I see like they all got yellow t-shirts on, right? So they're all matching. They're almost like glowing like the sun, right? Like, you can't miss them. Everyone can see them. And so I'm like, all right, that's interesting. Imagine my head immediately, maybe it's a youth group or something. They're doing some service project, whatever. I don't really care, whatever. And I get a little closer, then I see what's going on, and I see that they're grabbing grocery bags, and they're just handing them out to people who are walking down the street, right? It's almost like Oprah. You get a bag, everybody gets a bag, right? They're just handing out bags to everyone. Again, I don't really care at this moment, because I'm just thinking like, oh, silly church folks. We don't have a systematic way of working through these kind of things, but whatever, it's not my problem, right? But then I get, right as I'm crossing, I see what's on their shirt, and their shirt said, Harrisburg Invasion. Then I'm not laughing anymore. I'm like, who the hell do you think you are coming into our neighborhood, invading it? And I thought about it, and I was like, all right, like, I understand that some white people have like a savior complex, but it's usually not the motto of the events, right? Like, it's usually hidden back, but now it's just out there. Like, we're just naming what we're doing. The logics are exposed, unveiled, right? So I was actually at that moment pissed. I'm joking about it now, but like I was so angry. I was angry about that. And so I went around asking me like, what's up with this group who doesn't, and they told me, oh yeah, these churches from the other side, the West Shore, which is all white neighborhoods, they come in, they do once a year, their drive-by, 24-hour Harrisburg Invasion, and then you don't see them again for another year. And as I thought like how this in many ways represents some of the challenges of engaging on race in the 21st century. Because, well, number one, before I even get into that, after a while, this happened about 10 years ago, all right? And for a while, because I did workshops on race, I would talk about this and all. And then after a while, I started doubting myself that this actually happened. I was like, who would actually wear yellow t-shirts with Harrisburg Invasion? Did I make this up eventually? So I literally started I was gaslighting myself, right? I was gaslighting myself over this. And then I went on the internet, and that's how I actually found that picture. I was like, all right, yes, it did happen, okay. All right, I'll keep telling my story. So, but I did think about how it didn't, there were so many other ways this could have played out. This wasn't the only option available to them, right? And I think about how they could have taken the teachings of Jesus seriously, the first to last and last to first, and it kind of reoriented how they interacted with their neighbors, right? Because they could have came and said, look, we want to, number one, looked out for who were the leaders already at work in the neighborhood, right? And I worked in Allison Hill, there were amazing leaders, folks who've been at it for generations doing amazing things on the ground, that all they had to do was reach out and find out who was on the ground that they could partner with, right? And they might have said, oh, we got groceries that we would like to hand out. They might have said, no, keep your groceries, but here's some other ways that you can come alongside the work that we're already doing, right? But that would have required a couple things, right? That those who thought that they were always the teachers would have to humble themselves and become students. An inversion, a gospel inversion where the first are last and the last are first. Not always leading, but sometimes following. And that somehow, as one probably, I imagine that they were trying to come to help deliver other folks from their sufferings. But what they didn't realize is that if they had done it the right way, they would have found their own deliverance. That their own release from their own bondages would have been caught up and inextricably tied up in this joining and coming alongside what God was doing there on the ground. One of the really horrific things that we've done with the teachings of Jesus around servanthood is that we inverted Jesus' inversion. That is to say that Jesus does something brilliant. In the midst of hierarchy and domination, he invites people to take on the posture of servanthood as a way of rejecting and renouncing that way of life in the world. And strangely, white and Western Christians have inverted the inversion so that the power dynamics are all about the one serving. It's not a renunciation of social status. It's actually the practice of social status over others. Having everything to give and nothing to receive. And so there's an invitation, I think, for us to really think about the way that we participate, even in Christian practice, with Christian language that maybe does not actually reflect the way of Jesus Christ in the world. All right. I'll really briefly, I'm going to wrap up the story in a second, but I really briefly just want to mention a couple things that I think are worthwhile for folks to do as they're on this anti-racist journey, right? One is I've been emphasizing this idea that folks need to do some learning around race and place. race and place. We need to understand the way in which the land that we live upon, the places that we inhabit, how they have been engineered and organized by race, right? At the local, regional, state, and national levels, policies and practices were put in place to organize and literally engineer and shape our spaces to advantage white people and to disadvantage and harm black people. Learn about, and I always start, so where I live on the stolen land of the Susquehannock. That's where I always begin. Who were the indigenous people who lived on your land where you live? How and when were they displaced? What is their story, right? And then how do we move on? Who were, because you talk about forcible removal of indigenous people, and then the forcible stealing of black bodies onto land, right? What were your communities doing as that was happening, right? What were the policies during Jim Crow in terms of racially restricted deeds on homes, sundown towns, right? Redlining, highways being built through black neighborhoods, right? We could go on and on and on about all the different practices, state-sanctioned practices, right, that were done to help to organize and create our racialized society that we still have today. If we don't understand how we got to where we are today, how are we going to be a part of the healing presence moving forward in the future? So there's some race and place learning that we've got to do to tell more truthful stories, even of the land that we live upon, and how it got to the way that it is. We need to tell better intergenerational stories. I said last night, my students in class, they have this false imagination that, that their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were all about racial justice, right? And I hate to break it to them, but I was like, you imagine that your grandparents loved Dr. King, and the odds are that they probably hated him. Those are the odds. And they've got to sit with that, right? And one of the challenges is that generationally, one generation is not telling the truth to the next generation of their own sin and complicity and failures. And so there's no repentance intergenerationally and nothing to build upon. Each generation in white communities are starting from scratch with a vacuum in which they're contextless and apolitical and have no story to live into. Certainly not one grounding them in the way of Jesus Christ and what God is doing in the world. There's got to be intergenerational conversations, especially in white churches. Just as serious, people always say, well, in the black community, you hear about parents talking to their kids and having the talk, right? Well, why aren't you doing the same thing in your communities? Have the talk and have it at an intergenerational level. There needs to be accounting for the ways in which people both failed and inviting new generations to do better than you did. But it means you have to break the bubble for how they might perceive how you lived in the world. You have to be confessional enough to say, we failed. We got it wrong. We were on the wrong side. We stood at King, or at least we were silent and had not participated or spoke up on the major issues of our own time. But we're praying that you all can do better. We want to disciple you actually into the way of Jesus in a way that is faithful to the challenges that we face in our own generation. So there's intergenerational stories that need to be told. And then we also need resources for the journey, right? And every community has some, right? The spiritual resources, the songs, the traditions that you can draw on to live into something more faithful. Some of y'all got to go back a little farther to recover some stuff that maybe was lost, that whiteness stole, right? But from your own peoples and languages and traditions, where are the songs and traditions that sustain you in the work? What are the spiritual traditions, right, in your own communities that sustain you in the work as well? And so we need to be drawing from a deep well and recovering, adapting, learning from others, so that we have traditions and practices for our faith communities to do this work for the long haul. All right. So I want to talk about Bonhoeffer to close. I don't know, how many of you are familiar with Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Some, yeah. And so a lot of people know Bonhoeffer primarily because of one or two things. Usually, many people have read his book, Cost of Discipleship. That's a way that a lot of people enter into knowing about him. And the other is that just known for him in his participation in plots against Hitler and the kind of resistance, the confession movement, resistance against Nazi Germany, right? What a lot of people don't know about Bonhoeffer is so much more as it relates to his navigating the question of race in his own day. So Bonhoeffer was born in the early 20th century, most of his life, a little before World War I, but most of his life is really sandwiched between World War I and World War II. Bonhoeffer grew up in a well-to-do German family, butlers and things and help, family, all the things, highly educated, well-respected families. He got really educated highly at an early age, got his PhD really at a really, really early age, and he got the opportunity to travel the world and have all kinds of experiences. And in some ways, he's not necessarily someone you would imagine necessarily taking a radical move towards following Jesus in light of those that are the least, last, lost, and little ones based on his early life. In fact, some of his early writings are actually quite scary. If you read some of his early stuff, you could see that there were elements in there that could have easily leaned into some of what turned people towards the Nazi-Christian kind of alliance that took place in Germany at that time. And so Bonhoeffer, thoughtful, bright, intelligent, but there's nothing inherently in his life at that moment that says that he's going to have the path that he eventually does. But one of the things that happens for Bonhoeffer is that he randomly decides that he wants to study in America. So he comes to America in 1930. He studies, he just does 1 year. This is after he already got his PhD. And he does his studies. And while he's here initially, he goes to Union Theological Seminary. And while he's there for the first year, he's just making fun of Americans, American theology. They don't do real theology like we do in Germany and all of that, right? So he's got this sense in which, and he's definitely deeply concerned. He doesn't see the white American church as very meaningful in terms of what he's experiencing as well. But then he runs into Frank Fisher. Frank Fisher is one of the few black seminarians who is attending Union at that time. Frank Fisher's from Alabama. He would eventually actually be one of the leaders in the, I think it was the Birmingham movement with King and others later in the Civil Rights Movement. But this is earlier than that, right? So Frank Fisher is there, and Frank Fisher invites Bonhoeffer to church with him. Frank Fisher is an intern, right, at Abyssinian Baptist Church, the historic Black Baptist Church in Harlem, right? Adam Clayton Powell Sr. at that time is the pastor, right? So now, 1930, Bonhoeffer is going with Frank Fisher into Harlem, crossing racial boundaries and lines during the age of Jim Crow, and going to church with him. There's a black scholar, J. Cameron Carter, he said it once. He said he imagines that when Bonhoeffer first goes in there, he's probably like, I'm going to observe the Negro in his natural habitat, right? Probably very serious, right? Just some observations, going to take some notes on things. But that all gets thrown away real quickly, because he's caught up by what's happening there. There's a surplus. There's something else going on that he's trying to catch up to, right? Something's happening there. And so all of a sudden, Bonhoeffer, he's just captivated. He's actually writing back home about the black preaching and the Christ and and all these things, his experience in the black church. Before you know it, Bonhoeffer, he's volunteering on Wednesday. He's doing like Sunday school classes and teaching and all kinds of stuff. The tradition, we don't have any written evidence, but the tradition from the church is that Bonhoeffer actually got a chance to preach, which is quite striking if you think about it, because Adam Clayton Powell Sr. did not need any help in the pulpit, right? So this is talk about hospitality, right? In 1930, hospitality, right? Fully participating in the life of the church at a time where they cannot do that in white churches. He's been given this amazing hospitality in the life of the church. Bonhoeffer is expanding even beyond the church. He's reading Harlem Renaissance writers, and he's writing about them in his schoolwork. He's making decisions between, he likes W.E.B. Du Bois over Booker T. Washington because he thinks that resistance is necessary, right? He's advocating on behalf of the Scottsboro trials that are going on. He thinks it's a grave injustice what's happening to these black boys, and he's trying to get international attention to the issues that are going on there. He takes time to go to Howard to meet Negro intellectuals because he wants to meet them. He's invested in the lynching era and what's going on. All of these things, he's fully invested in this. But he's only there for 1 year. As a going away gift as he leaves, Frank Fisher gives him some Negro spirituals as records. And as 1933 comes to rise, Hitler writes, who's the first theologian writing up and speaking up on behalf of what's going on? Bonhoeffer's writing The Church and the Jewish Question, where he's calling on the church and its responsibility to stand in solidarity with the victim, right? To speak against what's going on, and if necessary, to put a spoke in the wheel. Now, Bonhoeffer's not perfect. If you read Bonhoeffer, you know all the nuances. He's fumbling his way through, trying to figure this thing out, right? But the one thing that we see throughout his life is that he is trying to follow Jesus through all of this. And we see that it leads him both in solidarity with black folk in the South, in the U.S., as well as then to speak up against the Nazi regime and the Jewish suffering that's going on there in Germany. And I think he's a powerful witness to the ways in which no matter where one begins, how one is socialized in the world, that we all have this opportunity and capacity to follow Jesus into the world in a way that resists the systems and structures and harm and finds us joining for him again and again, right, in solidarity with others. Last slide. So I want to read, this is a letter Bonhoeffer wrote, it's just a portion of a letter that Bonhoeffer wrote when he was in prison. So I should fill in the dots for those that don't know. So Bonhoeffer eventually is arrested for his conspiracy work against the regime, first put into prison, then a concentration camp, and then eventually he is hung in the concentration camps only a couple weeks before actually the war ends. But right before he had been arrested, he writes a letter to his friends after 10 years, right? It's this letter called After 10 Years. And this is just one portion of it. It says this: it remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled, in short, from the perspective of the suffering. If only during this time bitterness and envy have not corroded the heart, that we come to see matters great and small, happiness and misfortune, strength and weakness with new eyes, that our sense for greatness, humaneness, justice, and mercy has grown clearer, freer, more incorruptible, that we learn indeed that personal suffering is a more useful key, a more fruitful principle than personal happiness for exploring the meaning of the world in contemplation and action. And so for Bonhoeffer, this experience of following Jesus allowed him to begin to see the world from below. And I think that central, one of the things that we must do as a part of our Christian discipleship, if we are going to be joined to the stone that the builders rejected, right? To the one that was crucified by the state and given a state-sanctioned execution, right? If we're going to be joined to the one who couldn't help but find himself in the cracks and margins and edges of his own society, alongside the least, last, lost, and little ones, then we too also must see ourselves explore the world from below, from the vantage point of the crucified Christ. There is where resurrection is found, right? At the site of crucifixion. And we all must join in the struggle to understand our world, not from the vantage point of Caesar, but from the vantage point from below. All right. Thank you. So when I was in middle school, I was on a trip, and we ended up going, stopping for lunch at what was called at that time in Philly the Gallery, which is no longer, as malls go, no longer exists. But at that time, we were there, and you can go to the next slide. And while we were there, after we ate, we're kind of let loose in peers to kind of just get some energy out before we kept moving on. And we were we were middle school boys, let loose, unsupervised in a mall. And so we came upon an escalator, and there was only one way this could play out, right? There was no options. We were forced into this, which is that we were going to go up this escalator the wrong way, right? What else? There was no other options that it could have not played out this way. So we began to go up this escalator the wrong way. And as we go up this escalator the wrong way, we quickly learned a few lessons. There are a few lessons to learn as you're going up the escalator the wrong way. The first thing you learn really quickly is that it's not like a casual kind of movement. Like, it actually takes some intentionality, right? You gotta kind of be determined. If you want to get to that next floor, you gotta kind of get determined and intentional, step by step, and keep moving, right? And so we really quickly learned that it takes some effort to get into this. Then we learned really quickly is that we're not the only ones on the escalator, right? So as we're going up this escalator the wrong way, other people are coming down. So we're actually navigating and going against the grain of where most people are actually moving, right? And so we're moving and navigating around folks that are going in a different direction. And then also we learned, as you're doing that, as you're being deliberate and as you're going up the other way and you're trying to get to this next floor, you realize you can't take a time out. There's no pausing, right? Because if you stop on the escalator, even though your body's not moving, you're still going in a direction, right? It's still going to take you somewhere. And so there's no time out as you're a part of it, but you've got to keep striving and striding towards to get up to that next floor. And I think for me, that has become a really helpful analogy when I begin to think about the inertia of centuries, right? Of colonialism and slavery and racial oppression, centuries of making that has shaped the inertia that our country has been flowing in for all these many years. And I'm reminded of the fact that what does it mean then to say that Jesus has broken into this world and has created a counter way of life for us that we can participate in, but it's going to take some intentionality, some deliberateness, some setting our eyes towards God's dream for all creation, right? And as we are participating in the counter-revolution called God's kingdom, we're going to be sometimes clashing with the flow of how other people are moving and acting and interacting, how they've organized their lives according to the pattern of racial injustice and other forms of oppression that have shaped and defined our society. And that as much as we would like to think that we can opt out, doing nothing just means you're just being swept away by the inertia that's already at work in our society to begin with. And so the only option then is that faithful, persistent, setting our eyes towards God's dream for all creation, striving, intentionally navigating as a counter-witness to all that is going on in our society today. And I think for us, there's part of the work is that we need a bigger imagination shift for the kind of work that we're involved in, right? And that's why I like telling this story, because for me, it helps me remember that if we're going to get into this next floor, right? If we're seeking after that, then we have to be in it for the long haul. And we have to realize the kind of intentionality that it's going to require from us, the kind of counter witness it's going to require from us, and the kind of ongoing faithfulness over the long haul that it's going to require from us for us to continue to move towards God's shalom. So there's 4 things I want to do. First, just a real quick, briefly, just touch on a little church history. I call it Spark Notes version. Second, talk a little bit about my friend Barrabus in Scripture, because I believe he can help us think about Jesus a little bit. Third, we'll talk really briefly about transforming the church in terms of its internal integrity. And then finally, the ecclesial witness for justice as we wrap up, right? You can go to the next slide again, too. So again, Spark Notes. This even breaks my own heart for what I'm right about to do, right? For any historians, this is just the Spark Notes version. I certainly talk a little bit more about this in my book as well. But to oversimplify just a little bit, we'll talk about church history this way, right? A lot of times we think about like the first 300 years of the church. The churches are on the margins of society. They don't have a lot of political power. They're not controlling things. They're not dominating things. They are on the ground at the grassroots level, bearing witness to what God has done in Jesus Christ. And they can't even imagine under Caesar, right, shaping the political levers of society. But that doesn't mean that they've negated their socio-political call to participate in the society as a healing and justice-oriented community on the ground, right? But it's from the grassroots, from the bottom up, not top down. After the first 300 years, somebody by the name of Constantine comes to rise. He gets power, ends persecution, takes over the Roman Empire. There were other emperors, so to speak. There were 4, and now there's 1. He defeats everyone else, and he becomes the sole emperor. And so he begins to change policies and practices to favor Christians. So right before that happens, the church experiences one of the most severe Christian persecutions under Diocletian, and now all of a sudden the game has changed, and they've got somebody who's favoring the church. By 325, you got Constantine is convening bishops, right? He's presiding over councils, and he's helping to shape and unify folks together. The world has changed for Christians really quickly. They've gone from being the persecuted to now all of a sudden, sometimes they're persecutors, right? Because they've got power and influence, and sometimes they're persecuting not only pagans and those from other religions, but sometimes Christians who are just different from those who are in power at the moment, right? So from persecuted to persecutors at times, from the margins to moving into the center of society. Within 100 years after Constantine, like Theodosius, he actually makes Christianity the official religion of the land. Things are changing really fast for the church. Right? And so all of a sudden, the church is navigating a new world where, in fact, some scholars talk about how the bishops take the place of the Roman Senate, right? There's just so many different things that are going on in the life of the church at that time, and they're navigating it, and they're a little seduced by power, right? Not all of the Christians, not all of them, but it certainly is shaping the course of history for Western Christianity, certainly ongoing even beyond that. We move forward, by the time you get to about 1,000 years in, you have what scholars often call Christendom, right? This whole entire structure, I often call it Christian supremacy from the top down, right? Imposed, not bottom up, but imposed Christianity that is supposed to shape every institution, policy, practice, all the way, and it's a comprehensive vision for all of society. Imagine that they can mold society under the will of a Christian society, right? So that happens, and in the outflow of that, you have the Crusades and all these things that are happening as they imagine everything's unified under Christ, but again, coercively so. And then in the aftermath of all of that, in 1441, this self-professed Christian nation, Portugal, begins to enslave Africans. 1441. 1455, there's an official church teaching, a papal bull, a church teaching, and the church teaching pretty much says, you've got permission to go in the name of Jesus Christ to plunder, to enslave, to reduce to perpetual slavery is the actual language, perpetual slavery, all in the name of Jesus Christ. And so the church actually does the theologizing and heavy lifting and justifying for this plundering that's already beginning to happen. This is, mind you, all before Christopher Columbus. A lot of times we imagine that that's the initial. This is before Christopher Columbus. Then you have Columbus in 1492, who goes, and then there's actually another papal that pretty much reinforces what Pontifex Romanus Pontifex says in 1493. There's another one that even deepens that. And that is the explosion then for when, as European Christians are encountering people all around the world, there's as Jennings would say, a diseased theological imagination. As they are encountering others, there's something terribly already wrong with their Christianity and how they see those that are different from them, from different peoples and groups and places around the world. And so colonial conquest is literally birthed, Western Christendom births white supremacy into the world. Literally births it. That's what I was saying earlier when I say it's not quite enough to say that the church was complicit in racism. The church is the architecture upon which racism first is a theological error, and then takes on a life of its own in a whole bunch of sociological ways, right? And so there's a responsibility we have to grapple with the way that the church birthed the colonial era and white supremacy into our society. The outflow then, of course, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but the whitening of Jesus, and I often say, turning him into a mascot for the status quo and for social dominance, right? A mascot for these things. He's one of the early ships. In fact, it's the 1565, the first, it's a British ship taking Africans to the New World. It's called the Good Ship Jesus. Right? A mascot, converting, domesticating, colonizing, even the very name and idea of Jesus Christ is tied up now all of a sudden into this project. And it impacts all areas of Christianity: theology, discipleship, mission, ecclesiology, communal worship, storytelling, geography, economics, politics, our overall social imagination for how we live and relate. It's not just this little confines to when someone says the N-word or not, right? It's the whole entire world has been shaped outside and inside of this theological imagination. One of the interesting things, so if you read Ephesians 2, 11 through 22, we get this grand vision from Paul that Gentiles were once afar off, right? Outside the promises of God, but now through Christ Jesus, right, we've been brought near, and now breaking down the walls of humanity, there's now one where there were two, right? Jews and Gentiles, one in Christ, right? What's fascinating about that is the ways in which that gets inverted in this theological imagination, where now Israel has been replaced with the Western white church, but where Israel realized that people did not need to assimilate into all the practices of Israel because they were bound in Jesus, the white Western church has recodified this idea that everyone must assimilate into their way of being to become properly Christian, right? And imposing that way of being. And so I often call it a copyright, right? An imagination that Western Europeans often think they have a copyright on Jesus, a copyright on the biblical interpretation, and a copyright on theology, right? It's our product, we protect it, and you better practice it the way that we do, right? If you're gonna do it properly. And so there's this sense of control over Jesus, scripture, theology that everyone must conform to. And Jesus himself almost becomes, in some ways, then a colonized figure. That is, he is the idea of Jesus, the articulation of Jesus is being enfolded into a white supremacist framework. He fits in, right? And is retold within the imagination of a colonial world. So one of the things that we see is that, and it happens throughout history, but Jesus is actually severed from his Jewishness. That's one move, right? Is severing Jesus from his Jewishness. So that, I mean, you could say some people would recognize, he was a first century Palestinian Jew technically, but for all practical purposes, he was the best of the West, right? That's how he was understood, right? He's really, in all practical purposes, the best of the West. And then eventually, also then literally, visually transformed into a white man, a white American of that, right? This picture that I show is actually the most disseminated image of Jesus of all time. It's an American project that was born during Jim Crow era and disseminated everywhere around the world. Pretty much you can go to any corner of the world, and this is what people think of first and foremost in terms of Jesus, an image of Jesus, right? I always ask, even my students still will say like, oh yeah, my grandparents had that in their kitchen, or it was in the church basement, or such and such. It's everywhere, all around the world. And so Jesus, again, is further colonized, right, and becomes a symbol of social domination. And we've got to reckon with the ways that it's not just a visual error or a historical mistake in terms of what's going on, but it's a theological problem because it's associating at the very moment that there is social oppression and domination happening, Jesus is being identified with those in power. It's like identifying Jesus with the crucifiers rather than the crucified. Right? If there's a theological implication where Jesus is identified not with those who receive state-sanctioned execution under Rome, but those giving state-sanctioned execution under Rome, right? It's a reversal, again, of the reversal of what God has done through the incarnation of Jesus Christ. So what are the implications of a white Jesus, right? It's just inconsequential, right? No, it shapes everything because we are told that we are supposed to be like Christ, to imitate him, to follow in the footsteps of Jesus Christ, right? To be shaped and conformed to the image of the Son. So what happens when you bind Jesus to whiteness as it's practicing social domination? Huge implications, right? So in my backyard in Pennsylvania, central PA, we've got the famous, infamous Carlisle Indian boarding school. The most famous of all of them, although they were all horrific in their own ways, but Pratt, he was famous for saying this, right? Kill the Indian, save the man. Mind you, he was considered, this was supposed to be the gracious option. Kill the Indian, save the man. What does he mean? Not literally physically kill. He means sever the indigenous people from all their culture, their practices, their traditions, their ways of life, their clothing, sever them from their names and all how they move and comport in the world. Right? And you can hear, if you're biblically literate enough, you can hear all things die, all things become new. Again, a diseasing of a biblical imagination here, where Western Christianity is conflated, Western society and civilization is conflated with Christianity, unable of severing and differentiating the one from the other, and then imposing a vision upon which everyone to become like Jesus. Again, at the end of the day, Jesus is promised, but people are actually being conformed to the image of Western society and Western man. In South Africa, I think this quote actually, different communities claim, I think, where it came from. So there's some debate, but some say Desmond Tutu is their originator. But this is the quote: when the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and we had the lands, right? They said, let us pray. We closed our eyes. And then when we opened them again, we had the Bible and they had the land, right? Christianity's literally participating in the plundering of land, facilitating the theft, right, of land itself, the colonial conquest that takes place globally throughout Africa, throughout the Americas, through parts of Asia. Christianity's facilitating and justifying that, and often missionaries and militarism were going hand in hand to make this thing possible. Obviously in the United States, starting, technically you could say 1565 if you count Florida, but 1619 usually where we start in terms of thinking about the history of slavery, in terms of how that ties into the American history. And so from 1619 to 1865, we have legal, racialized chattel slavery, where people are reduced to property, where people can be sold, where people are literally getting insurance on bodies, right? It's full capitalistic society. People sometimes miss the fact that it's actually quite a sophisticated capitalistic society that's making the whole engine run, like society. From 1865 all the way through till the Civil Rights Movement, you have the Jim Crow era, right? And what we see is a morphing and a mutating of the slave system. So now all of a sudden, post-slavery, a few things we see, right? Chain gangs, convict leasing systems, peonage, right? And sharecropping, all different ways and systems of creating neo-slavery in the post-Civil War era, right? Other ways of, as one scholar says, slavery by another name, right? And how does that happen? And then, of course, how does it function? White supremacy, terrorism, KKK, the rise of lynching, right? Which was not a big thing during slavery, it's after slavery that lynching becomes a phenomenon as one way to evoke terror and fear into the lives of others, knowing this is what happens if you don't fall in line with the social order, this new emerging system that arose during that time. And then, of course, on the heels of the Civil Rights Movement, as things actually did begin to change, some laws, right? Then there's pushback once again and another mutation, and we have the rise of the prison industrial complex and over 2 million people locked up in prison, the largest prison population our world has ever known in human history. That makes nations that are considered repressive look like freedom-loving places in comparison to like no other place in the world arrests minorities and those most vulnerable from vulnerable populations at the rate that America does. And so these are all dynamics that have shaped our world, and you can see the transformation of our society over and over again, but not transformation of our society. So I want to talk real quickly about Barrabus, and hopefully we'll get a glimpse. I talk more about it in my book, and Who Will Be a Witness, but just a little glimpse to help see the ways that Barrabus helps us see Jesus a little bit more carefully. So I don't know about you and what your associations are with Barrabus, but I think oftentimes people fall into one or two camps in terms of how they typically think about Barrabus, because most people do not do Bible studies on Barrabus, apparently. Apparently that's not a popular topic. So one or two, either folks are influenced from mainstream like movies and such in terms of how they think about Barrabus, and there's films where Barrabus is literally like, almost like crazed in a stereotypical sense, right? And he's laughing uncontrollably. And the idea is that something's off with his mind. He's just this crazed maniac who just went around killing folks for no reason at all, no rhyme or reason, right? And so there's this kind of reputation. He's sometimes cockeyed or foaming at the mouth or something, but there's something off with him, and he's just an evil, crazed person going through the villages killing people. And then a more gentle version that's not quite as stark as that is that some people, they go to Barrabus and they think theologically, they're trying to think about atonement theology, and so it's, Barrabus took Jesus' place, and so each and every one of us are Barrabus, right? Because he took our place. Jesus stood in the gap, right? And what's fascinating about both of those things is that none of them have anything to do with what the Bible actually says about Barrabus. The Bible says something about Barrabus. It's actually very clear. There's only one thing it wants to tell you about who Barrabus was, and it's the very thing that most people actually ignore and dismiss overall. So before we get to there, I want to give a little background history, just real quick. So in the first century, one of the things you got to understand is revolution is in the air. right? In fact, way before them, even before, like when you think about going back to the Maccabees and such, right? Revolution, I mean, the Maccabees are legendary by the time you get to Jesus' life for their own resistance to empire, right? So now, as they're under Rome, before Jesus is born, during Jesus' lifetime, and after, there are ongoing revolutionary groups that are participating in resisting to Rome at that time. The Sicarii, the Daggermen, all these different groups, the Lestai, right? You have these different revolutionary groups that are participating in revolutionary action, all the way leading up to the Jewish-Roman War, right? 66 to 70 AD, decades after Jesus is alive, right? So revolution is in the air, and the gospel writers are actually recording their stuff decades after Jesus was alive, was when they're actually being written down and collected all the oral stories of Jesus compiled into one story, right? And so that's a big concern for the gospel writers. What's going on, and how do we make sense of the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, what's happening in the backdrop of all of that, right? And so I want us to just be aware of that this is an enormous, the destruction of the temple was an enormous thing that happened, and it was extremely violent. I'm talking about like thousands and thousands and thousands are killed. I think they say 6,000 Jews are crucified in the Jewish-Roman War alone. I mean, it's a bloodbath, it's horrific, it's terrifying, it's traumatic, and people are trying to understand where's God in the midst of this, right? So, what does the Bible actually have to say about Barrabas? Pretty clear. Let's see, Mark 15:7. A man called Barrabas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. Luke 23:19. Barrabas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Luke 23:25. He released the men who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. Even John, who oftentimes we think of as just thinking about theological things, no, John is pretty clear here. John 18:40, they shouted back, "No, not him, give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising, right? And it's interesting that Matthew actually has a longer thing. I'm not going to show the whole thing now, but you can look at it. But in Matthew 27, there's actually a longer kind of conversation going on around Jesus and Barabbas. But the key part that I want to pay attention to is verses 16 and 17. It says, "At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, 'Who do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah?'" Right? And that's really fast. Now, I will say, just as you go into your Bibles, this is a little, just for the side note, for those who want to do a little biblical scholarship or want to understand some things, depending on what biblical translation you have, you are going to find some different things here. So if you have the King James Version or the ESV, you're not going to find Jesus Barabbas in that. But you have the more scholarly translations like NRSV, NET, CEB, any of those at all, you're going to find the translation Jesus Barabbas, which is believed to be the oldest manuscripts that King James didn't have available to them when they were compiling their Bible. But anyway, long story, that's for the Bible scholars in the room. All right. So what's fascinating, though, is that I think Matthew's very intentional about him saying Jesus Barabbas versus Jesus the Messiah, precisely because he wants us to think about something really important. We got a choice to make. Jesus, Yeshua, Joshua, the one who saves, the one who liberates. Who will be your liberator? Who will be your savior? Who are you trusting in, right? Barabbas, son of the Father. Son of the Father. Who's the son of the Father? Who, again, are you putting your trust in? Who will be your Messiah, right? Understand that they are under the conditions upon which they are struggling, right? Under Roman oppression and exploitation and degradation. And they have this really significant choice that they've got to make between Jesus, who appears, at least up until his capture, to be down for the cause. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. He preached the kingdom of God for the poor. And that's what he does throughout his ministry, prioritizing the poor and the oppressed and those who are hurting and struggling and offering them hope for a new world to come. but then he's arrested non-violently, just gives himself up. That's the exact moment where the disciples, if you remember, they're all pulling out their swords. They're like, this is the moment. We know what this means. It's time to strike. Barrabus, on the other hand, he's got a proven record. This guy's going down swinging, right? He's already participated in uprising, so we know he's about it. It's striking that I talk about in my book, I joke that you find that all the gospel writers leave it an unnamed disciple, right, cuts the ear off, except for John. John snitches on Peter, right? So there's a little tension there, like, you haven't put this in the record, who it was. So I don't know what that's about, but anyway. But clearly, up to that point, they see there's a lot in common between them, enough that it can confuse them about what Jesus' mission is all about. It's not a spiritual one versus a political one. Like, that's the mistake that people have made, is Jesus was just spiritual and he was political. That doesn't make sense, because Jesus wasn't just spiritual. He said, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, right? And he did work here and now in this world. But it was the means by which they were going about it that was different. The means of the Messiah, right? Jesus was willing to be crucified rather than to kill his enemies. He was committed to loving his enemies even as he pursued justice and spoke truth to power. Barrabus was willing to kill his enemies in the process. So I want to suggest, when you're thinking about Barrabus, you got to think a little more Nat Turner and a little less the Joker, right? That is to say that Barrabus, he's desperate. This is a person who deeply cares about his people. He's seen the horror and the oppression and the disproportionate suffering that his people were undergoing. And Barrabus believes, he's not a secularist. He believes that he's participating in what God is doing. And Jesus is like, yes to most of those things. I care also about the suffering and the oppression and the poverty, right? But the means by which we go about it, you're missing the end goal of beloved community, of where I'm trying to go, right? And that it's not just the end goal, but the very means that we go about it, of participating in the kingdom of God, is just as important as how we get there. I believe that when we begin to look at Barrabus and see that, then we all of a sudden recognize that we've got a nonviolent, but still nonetheless revolutionary witness in the life of Jesus Christ, that stood and challenged empire, that spoke truth to power, that prioritized the least, last, lost, and little ones, the poor, the hungry, the sick, the stigmatized. And we have an invitation to follow after Jesus in that same way as well. And I think that one of the things that we have to do is wrestle with the ways that we've domesticated, that Western Christianity has so deeply domesticated discipleship to Jesus Christ, so that it means none of those kind of social things. We've ripped out the majority of Jesus' life and teachings and said it's irrelevant, right? We found ways to skirt, avoid, or somehow make the very plain, radical things that Jesus say not mean what they seem to say. So I think that we have to reckon with the ways that Christian discipleship has been domesticated. I often tell my students that we do what I call the cradle to the cross jump, right? Everybody loves baby Jesus, right? He's so sweet and so cuddly and so kind, right? And so warm and fuzzy. We get fuzzy feelings, right, in our gut. And then for most people, everything in between, it doesn't really matter. We just got to jump to the cross, right? And that's the only thing that, for many Christians, those are the only things that actually matter about the life of Jesus. That Jesus died for you. And in making that move, which Jesus does not do in interpreting his own life, but by making that move, we again find a really sophisticated way to ignore, again, the majority of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which actually have a lot to say about how we live in this world, and the priorities and our commitments and our relationships and how we engage power and speak truth to those that harm others, right? Jesus gives us an example of that. My colleague, Richard Crane, he jokes, he says that we treat Jesus like the crazy uncle at the family gathering, right? He's an Alabamian, so he has a little accent when he says it, but he jokes and he says that, you're at the family gathering, imagine you're at Thanksgiving dinner, and you bring a friend over with you, and you warn them up front, I got this one uncle, he's going to be saying some stuff, right? But don't worry, nobody takes him seriously, right? You just warn him ahead of time, right? And he's saying, that's how we do with Jesus, right? Oh, he says all these radical, but Jesus doesn't really mean all that stuff about the poor. He doesn't really mean that stuff, right? And so it's just a way up front of negating the radical teachings of Jesus that actually would apply to how we actually engage our society today. Go next one. So when I am at my house and I have guests over, the thing I always say, which I think, we all been taught to say, right? Make yourself at home, right? Come on, make yourself at home. And I say that because I don't want people to come up in my house. I want everyone all uptight. I don't want folks, I just want folks to be comfortable and relaxed. And so I want them to know they can come in, kick their shoes off, put their feet up. They can even go into the kitchen, grab a cold drink. I just want people to feel comfortable when they're in my house. But if I'm really honest, I don't really mean make yourself at home, right? There's some things I don't actually mean. God's still working on me on this hospitality thing because there's a line for me in terms of what I actually mean when I say that, right? So if somebody comes into my house, I don't want to see them come in and start rearranging my furniture because they're making themselves at home, right? Or certainly don't want them to take down my family pictures and put up their pictures because they're making themselves at home. And I certainly do not want to come in and see them coming down the steps in my bathrobe, right? That's off the limb. That's not what I mean when I say make yourself at home. And so I don't really actually mean fully belong in that space. There's some boundary lines that I still have. God's working on me in terms of hospitality, right? And so, but the thing is so I'm married. Some of y'all know I got 3 kids, and my wife Renee, she knows she has full belonging in our house, right? She's got full belonging. So it's not strange for me to come home and for things to be rearranged. It's not strange for pictures to be updated, right? And despite all my protesting, she still wears my favorite hoodie, right? I can't get her to stop wearing it, right? Full belonging, right, in the household. That's what happens when you fully belong, right? Then you can kind of interact in that way. But her sense and understanding of her belonging is even bigger than those surface things. It goes bigger than that because her belonging is also about what does it mean for our entire family and our growing, over the years, going from just the 2 of us to all of a sudden 5 of us together, right? And so that has meant that over the time, it'd be hey, Drew, what do you think about, knocking out that little closet space and putting a little extra half bathroom? Because, we can't all be using one bathroom all this time, right? We need a little. And so she's thinking structurally about how the house functions. And one time she even said, maybe we could just knock out this whole entire wall so there's some more movement space for the kids to kind of move around and stuff, right? She's thinking about structural changes to the edifice of the building itself so that everyone who we say belongs here can actually thrive and flourish in the way that they need to, right? And that's a deeper level, right? There's different kind of levels of change that we're talking about here. And I think, every single church, we already know this, every church says, oh, you're welcome here. Everybody says that, right? Nobody's special for saying that you're welcomed in their space because every church says that. But usually welcome to assimilate into our spaces, right? But what does it mean to actually talk about belonging in a way that actually produces actual transformation of how we gather together? Both in terms of the way that the aesthetics of the space, right? That we actually are willing to change the aesthetics of how we actually live and what we see and how we move and the way that we have full belonging to enter into spaces. But what does it actually mean then to actually make structural changes to how we organize our lives together for full belonging in the body of Christ, right? That's a whole different level. And that's one of the ways that if people are at least willing to go to the aesthetic level often will resist the full transformation, willing to radically reorganize our lives based on who we say we are and who belongs in our spaces together. We've got to have a little more integrity internally in the life of the church to practice justice internally. If we can't be just internally, then why are we asking so much of the world to do all kinds of stuff that we're not even willing to do a fraction of it in our own spaces, right? I'm going to skip the next 2 slides, and we're going to now talk about ecclesial witness for justice. So one of the things that a lot of scholars and others will talk about is this idea of praxis, right? Praxis. And praxis is the combination of active reflection and reflective action, right? And it's the cycle, the ongoing cycle of these things. And what's really important about that is that, there are some churches that are doers, right? Some churches just want to do stuff, right? Keep doing, and they don't ever want to stop to reflect on what they're doing. No critical examination of their practices, and if there's changes needed, and if there's other insights from others that can be incorporated into what they're doing to be more faithful. Other churches are like hyper intellectual, right? They just want to do book studies, one after the other, and they think that the life of the church is just a book study progression from one to the next, but never actually living and embodying anything that they're actually reading, right? It's just an intellectual endeavor. And I think what praxis invites us to do is to be in the cycle where we are living and engaging our minds and reflecting on what's happening and ongoing in the cycle, seeking God, seeking and discerning together, learning from others as we practice what we are doing. And you course correct as you go as a part of the embodied practice of actually being disciples of Jesus in the world, right? Discipleship not just being book studies, but I'm saying discipleship as in following Jesus into the world. What does it mean to actually do that as a part of our lives? It said, give a man a fish, right? And he'll what? Right? Teach a man to fish but what happens when there's no access to the pond? What happens when it's blocked off? Then all of a sudden you got a structural problem that you've got to deal with, right? And sometimes some of our individual practices to care for others and love for others and some of our really beautiful and important mercy ministries that are helping people aren't going to address the structural issues that are impacting those that desperately need liberation from the issues that they're struggling from. And so we've got to begin to shift also not only towards the individual care of people, but the transformation of our society and the structural impediments that actually harm advantage and disadvantage people in society. I think that in Luke 19, Jesus, he approaches Jerusalem and he mourns over Jerusalem. And he laments, and he says, if only they had known the things that make for peace. And that's the same passage where Jesus is there shown to be predicting the Jewish-Roman war, the armies surrounding Jerusalem and destroying them and leaving no stone unturned, right? So there's this deep lament for Jerusalem, but there is also this suggestion, not only that they're choosing a path of destruction or death-dealing path, but that there is a way of peace. There's another way that we can go about the work that we're going to do. And I want us to think about what are the things that make for peace? How do we pursue that in our world today? There's a couple things real quick that I'll mention that I think are just big and important, and then we'll kind of get into more specifics. But I think that as Christians, there's some things that we've got to be able to just draw on and be consistent about. First and foremost, every person is made in the image of God. Therefore, we protect the vulnerable and recognize the humanity of even our enemies. 2, we break cycles of violence and creatively maximize peace and justice. We resist evil without becoming evil, right? Overcoming evil with good is what we were taught to do. 3, the call to take up our cross in the way of Jesus is a courageous, nonviolent, revolutionary response to death-dealing empire. We obey Jesus, not Caesar. And so we take our marching orders not from the empire, but from Jesus Christ. And then finally, I think that we have an invitation then to seek to find and participate in the things that make for peace in our world. We should be peacemakers and people who do justice in our communities. That's some of what we should be known for. I want to move a little bit from theology and biblical studies to more social science for a little bit, okay? To think about practices. There's really some really interesting scholarship that has come out around social change and how social change happens and works in our world. And I think it'd be helpful for us to be aware of what people are seeing happening all around the world and the scholarly insights that can offer us some guidance in some of those practices. So one of the things is that despite popular opinion, especially in the US at this particular moment, nonviolent resistance is actually an extremely effective way of bringing change when it follows certain things, right? One, it needs to be creative, strategic, active, and sustained, right? And I guess the thing with that is, I think sometimes our imaginations can be restricted by what has happened in the past. So sometimes, or even our interpretation of what happened in the past. So a lot of times we think about the civil rights movements, and most people just think about marches, right? And so people are just stuck on what I call the one-hit wonder. What do you do against injustice? We're going to have a march, right? And I'm not saying that there aren't times for a march, but there are a lot of other ways that people engage in nonviolent resistance other than just marching. There's a guy by the name of Gene Sharp, brilliant scholar who collected and did a global study, and this was in the 70s, he compiled 198 different tactics for ways that we can actually engage in nonviolent work that he saw being effective, again, under both democracies and dictators, right? A whole range of different ways that people were engaging in this work. And what scholars have been finding, and Erica Chenoweth in particular has found, is that nonviolent movements globally are actually twice as successful as violent ones. It completely blows up our perceptions of what's actually working, and the gap is growing, that nonviolent resistance is actually growing in effectiveness, and violent uprisings are actually decreasing in effectiveness overall. Social science tells us that nonviolent campaigns that reach sustained and active involvement from, watch this, 3.5% of the population are always successful. And the number, it used to be 5%, and then it dropped when they did this closer study. This was Erica Chenoweth's work, found that it was unsustainable for society. If it's, again, it has to be sustained. It's not just people showing up one time, but a sustained movement that are active and involved and invested fully, that it's unsustainable for society, even at 3.5% of the population. Now, granted, that's still a lot of people in the grand scheme of things, but it also changes. It's not about winning every single person for bringing actual change, right, in society. It's actually much more doable than people realize. Nonviolent resistance is growing in effectiveness, again, while violent resistance is actually decreasing overall in effectiveness. We can go, that's not. There we go. So I want to talk about two different kind of approaches to social change, two broad camps of social change work. One is mass protest movements, the other one is community organizing. I want to talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses around some of this. Mass protest movements, I mean, the key word really is mobilization. How do we mobilize people is the idea. And the goal is usually mass participation, get broad participation. A lot of times, people's first avenue and step into social change work is often going on marches or mass protest movements of some sort. And people, in some ways, there's a sense of safety that people find as they can step into the large numbers. Even sometimes, even if the crowd is doing some pretty rowdy stuff, people sometimes feel comfortable in the numbers to kind of enter into that kind of space. A lot of times, there can be disruption, confrontation, a whole bunch of different methods for using it, escalation of tactics. But one of the things that mass protest movements actually are focused on is shifting public opinion. And that kind of sometimes gets lost, but the focus and the emphasis is shifting public opinion. And one of the strengths of it is that it can often really, participating in movements, it can ride cultural momentum. Again, participation's easy, and sometimes scholars talk about the whirlwind, this moment where something's in the air and it's happening and you can really usher it to bring some more change in society, right? And so you can leverage that through mass protest movements as well. In fact, they would argue you can instigate even the whirlwind itself, but that's a whole nother conversation. One of the weaknesses that people have found around mass protest movements, though, is that with little commitment, because usually there's no commitment to the work, and there's not often always structure to it, and so those things can die just as easily as they come, right? They can come in strong and they can just dissipate as well. But one of the arguments that people also make is that sometimes the impact is much greater than people actually recognize, even when it dies out. That it has actually sometimes shifted public opinion and conversations much greater than people often recognize. And so anyway, that's interesting. So let's go to the next. And a few examples, obviously, Me Too movements, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter. These are some examples, some national mass protest movements, right, over the past decade. So then there's community organizing, and the key word really is organization, right? Organization is really huge for this kind of social change work. Strategy is really about, a lot of times you'll hear organizers talk about power and building power. And what they mean is not top-down power, but decentralize the power of the people. How do we bring people together and help people recognize that they have agency? That is, in fact, the organizers always say the definition for power is the ability to act. And we all have the ability to act. That means we all have power to influence what's going on in our society in some way. So how do we bring people together for that collective power, that collective agency to make a difference in our neighborhoods? And this kind of organizing work, a lot of times, the famous example that people give is like, sometimes they start small, like we need a stop sign, right? at the street, and help people realize that they can get a stop sign, right? When they come together and work collectively, then they can start working on some bigger things, right? And some issue, and the focus is often on what are the issues that are impacting that neighborhood, right? What are their own felt needs, and how can they collectively make a change to bring it? It's usually incremental change. It's usually more legislative change. So like specific goals that they have, right? So it's not usually about changing narrative, but it's about specific goals. Like we want this policy put into place, or we want minimum wage to go to $15 an hour, right? It's that kind of thing. But it's change over the long haul, right? That's usually the focus is change over the long haul. And so meeting one-on-ones with people, connecting, bringing people together. People are committed to it, right? You commit to long-term work, and then you go about it. And one of the strengths is that whether it's popular, it's in the news or not, people can be organizing and making a difference, whether it's in the news cycle or not. It can be happening, right? One of the critiques of organizing, especially the classical Saul Alinsky style organizing, is that sometimes folks who are organizers can be very rigid. And I think this is changing a little bit recently, but can be rigid about method, right? So there could be a moment where the whirlwind has come, and they're like, well, we don't do movement work, right? And their ability to organize could actually be leveraging that moment to actually have a lot of impact for the movement, but they're about, well, this is what we do. We don't do that mass activism stuff. We do the organizing on the ground stuff. And so the ideological rigidity can actually limit some of the impact and possibilities that are available sometimes. The thing about the two together, though, is that I think, for me, like the church doesn't need to be committed to any one singular philosophy for social change, though I do think that we ought to be thinking about how does our faithfulness connects with effectiveness. Are there ways in which those two things can overlap? Because we care about our neighbors and their experience, right? What's actually happening, we care about their well-being, and we want change, but we want to do it faithfully in a way that pleases God, right? And so to think about the things that make for peace is to think about the ways that our effectiveness and our faithfulness can actually coalesce. And we can actually learn from the strategies of others, and then learn from the teaching of Jesus and see where do these things coalesce? Are there opportunities for us to be more effective in bringing social change in our communities? That are evidence-based too, just as well as pleasing to God, right? And I think that there's some things that we can learn. This is just a little small sample of ways that we can be thinking about different social change methods. In my community, and I think all around the country, there are lots of faith-based organizations that do this kind of work. I'm sure you all probably, many of you know already, some of the folks doing this kind of good work in your communities, that kind of on-the-ground community organizing work. So I'm going to end with a story. In 1963, when King goes to Birmingham and they're struggling to challenge the segregation systems in Birmingham, they find themselves over time frustrated, right? Because they're not getting the kind of responses that they wanted. And this one particular moment, they get an injunction against marching, and they've run out of bail funds, and Passover and Easter weekend is right around the corner, and they've got to figure out what they're going to do. So they all get into a hotel room and they gather together. It's in Dr. King's hotel, and it's one of those hotel rooms where, if you can imagine, there's a room, like a living room space, and then a separate door with a bedroom, right? So it has and so a bunch of leaders, imagine, I don't know exactly how many, but I imagine like maybe 10 to 12 leaders sitting around a table talking about what they need to do. And they're all debating, and some are like, well, we got to just keep going forward. We're going to go against the injunction. I don't care what happens. We're going to get arrested. We're going to jail, whatever. We got to keep plowing forward. Others like, wait a minute now. This is Birmingham, a.k.a. Bombingham. This is not a place you want to just be willy-nilly just going to jail. Like, folks are being killed out here. We got to slow this down and be really thoughtful and careful, and especially because we don't have any more bail funds. I'm not trying to go to Birmingham jail indefinitely, right? And so why don't we send Dr. King out to raise some funds, and then we can reboot this thing when we got some bail funds, right? Others are like, wait, that's all nice, but, Good Friday, Easter, this is the biggest weekend in the church calendar. This is huge. I have responsibilities. Most of them are pastors and clergy, right? They got responsibilities with their home churches, and so I got to go tell the good story, right, of what Jesus has done. I can't be, out here messing around. I need to be back with my congregation. And so they're all debating. If there's 10 people there's 11 different views on what they should be doing, right? And the whole time, Dr. King, he's just sitting there, and he hasn't said anything at all. He hasn't contributed one word of advice. He hasn't added in anything. He's just sitting there listening. And then suddenly, Dr. King gets up, and he leaves the room and closes the door. And there's their fearless leader, right? Minutes go by. Then all of a sudden, door opens back up. Dr. King comes out, and something's different about Dr. King now. Dr. King has changed his clothes. And all of a sudden now, normally you think of him as a black suit, clean cut, tie, right? Always trying to have a certain look, posture. But now he's changed his clothes, and now he's wearing blue jeans and a blue work shirt. And the moment they saw him, everybody knew exactly what that meant immediately. It's time to roll up our sleeves and get to work, right? And they knew at that moment, when he had his blue jeans on, that meant that they were going to go against the injunction, that they were going to get arrested, they're going to go to jail, and they're going to bear witness to what God is doing in the world on the streets, right? And because of him putting on his blue jeans, it was an invitation, right, for them not to merely celebrate Good Friday and Easter, but to literally embody the story of Jesus in the public square, to share in his sufferings as they sought for the healing and liberation that God was at work in the world doing already. A deeper, you could say, celebration of Easter. And I think for us today, as you all are here, we're gathered thinking about what does it mean to be united together as we pursue racial justice together here in our community. What does it mean that we are all invited to put on our blue jeans, right? To put on our blue jeans for justice, to put on our blue jeans for God's healing, to put on our blue jeans to let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, right? To put on our blue jeans because of the neighborhoods in our community that have been red lines and neglected, right, and oppressed, and the opportunities that we have for the children and families that have been disproportionately suffering right? For way too long, waiting on the church to be the church, to embody, not just talk about Jesus, but to embody and make visible the Jesus story in our very lives. And so my hope and my invitation is that as we think about this long history, some of it beautiful, church history, I didn't get to cover a lot of the beautiful, but there are lots of beautiful, but there's also a lot of harm and pain and ugly in the Western church in particular story. And here's an opportunity for us to go up the escalator the wrong way, put on our blue jeans, and to participate in what God is doing in the world. God bless.